Accelerated Trumpland, a podcast with Tara Brabazon and Steve Redhead. Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon. I'm the Dean of Graduate Research at Flinders University and the Professor of Cultural Studies. And it's my great pleasure to conduct a podcast with Professor Steve Redhead, also the Professor of Cultural Studies at Flinders University. And the podcast this week is titled Accelerated Trumpland. So let me explain how we got here. We recorded a podcast some months ago called The University of Trumpland. It has been, by an inordinate margin, the most downloaded podcast we've ever recorded. We are in the hundreds of thousands of downloads. So you may agree with us, you may disagree with us, but clearly we had something to say that had a bit of resonance. So I decided that, considering everything that's happened in the last few days, let alone a few weeks or few months, we really needed to return to the ever-inking well of the Trump presidency. And I wanted to explore the notion of acceleration. And the reason we're here today is Steve Bannon resigned, was pushed, quit, vacated the building like Elvis, we'll never find out, yesterday. And that is, I think, a major moment, a chaotic major moment in what is already a chaotic presidency. So I wanted to talk about speed. I wanted to talk about acceleration because things are moving quickly, and I just wanted to capture this for us. Can I also do a shout out that our wonderful former PhD student, now successfully through her degree program, Sunny Rujavara, Steve and I have written an article which is currently under reviewing on Trump studies, and it is now becoming a book that I believe is within about 10 days of being completed. Again, called Trump Studies. So this is a big area for us. There will be publications in this field coming out in the next 2-3 months or so. So, Steve, let's get into this. And good morning, good sir.
Good morning, Tom.
Okay, let's get into this. Steve, wow, why has this presidency been on amphetamines? It feels like a presidency on meth, Steve. So how is speed operating in contemporary politics?
Yes, I think it's a good question. My idea of accelerated culture, which I brought in a book called Paul Virilio, Theorist for an Accelerated Culture, which I wrote in 2004, actually.
Great book.
Has now almost come of age. People are very interested in that idea of acceleration. I think that's partly to do with media acceleration, 24/7 media and also social media. But I think it's also reflecting a lack of tolerance in the culture for authority and for, if you like, the ideas of so-called elites and so on. Expertise.
Yeah.
So that, longevity in a presidency or a government anywhere around the world really has almost disappeared. But I think it's interesting that you mentioned that we did this almost knee-jerk podcast after the surprise Trump victory.
Yes, it was like a Conrad Heart of Darkness. It was like
horror. Very shortly after the election, which was very unexpected. I think people have to, in terms of accelerated culture, people have to remember that this was a very unexpected victory. I think personally that the Trump camp also were very surprised that they actually won. They flipped it backwards, but actually I think people were surprised that they actually won, and they didn't win the popular vote.
Yeah.
But I think what's happened since is that the idea of a stable government in the US is really almost laughable. And you've lost a huge number of people, including the most recent, the far-right advisor for the president, Steve Bannon, who has actually returned to the far-right website that he was chief executive of before, almost within a day.
Yeah.
So that's quite interesting.
Yes.
And I think you should watch that space.
Oh, yeah.
But I do think that you've shifted gear as far as governmentality is concerned. This is a president who is just all over the place, certainly has spoken for the far right, but as Zizek says, he's also a centrist liberal one day. So I think there are all kinds of I know Zizek has got criticised for that, but I think there are all sorts of contradictions in the space of the White House and governmentality in the US, which actually were already broken. And I think Trump's election to the presidency has kind of almost what Steve Bannon wanted, it's almost reset capitalism in the US and governmentality in the US. I don't think there's any doubt that someone like Bannon wanted that. And you've almost got that.
Yeah, it feels a lot like, as we've talked, Steve Bannon is crucial to this. We're going to come back to this in a minute, I think. But Steve Bannon from the right was very much implementing a Trotskyite permanent revolution, to overthrow the state. And I think we really shouldn't forget that. That's how radical this particular project was.
He actually said he wanted to deconstruct the administrative state in one early speech.
And look, isn't it fascinating the language we're using? I also think he used deconstruction correctly, but then 99% of the population do, and I have to let that go, Stephen. But I love also your use of governmentality too, because it is feeling more Foucault than Althusser. And that disturbs me a little bit, except, of course, noting the regicide that started discipline and punish. So maybe we could end up there in some interesting form. But, Steve, why is this presidency feeling like reality television at the very point that the genre of reality television is actually declining?
Yeah, I think that's a terrific point, because certainly for many years, Trump used the ideas and tropes of reality television, particularly the idea of humiliation of people. Yeah. He was doing that in his businesses before reality TV got on board, and actually he fitted reality TV very well. Yeah. And in some ways he's not connected with reality. It's a reality TV presidency in many ways. Also, there is the idea that, this is not a real job. Politics is not a real job. The presidency of the USA is not a real job. And I think you've had that before. You've had the kind of lazy frat boy idea of George W. Bush, for example, who's now being rehabilitated in the media, which is incredible to me.
Yes, it's like the Brains Trust. It's like, wow, we're there.
But you have to remember that's not very long ago. No. And I think what actually has happened is that you've got a surprise, almost like a silent coup in the presidency of the United States. People didn't expect it to happen. If they'd done more of the checking in the media, which now has come to the fore, if they'd not had moral equivalency in their media coverage of Clinton versus Trump, both as bad as each other, and actually Trump's even better. And I think that idea of, if you like, the really real, what Baudrillard calls the hyper-real, is something that has continued at speed. This is the interesting thing, I think, at speed in accelerated culture, even though reality TV as a mode has started to fall off the edge.
Yeah, it is my tumbling simulacrum, isn't it?
It is.
Because I developed, how many years ago now? 10?
10 years.
10 years ago, the working with Baudrillard, the notion of the real, the representation, the simulacrum.
Absolutely.
I used it to teach, of course. I used a way to teach Baudrillard to first-year students. Yeah. But I then developed that argument through literacy theory that it is a cascading simulacrum. Yes. So that means the simulacrum in one system becomes the real in the next.
Absolutely.
And then that is spinning as a top at increasing speed. So it's spinning. So we actually lose the capacity to even know that we're clocking over into a simulacrum.
That's right. And we did do a joint article, open access article, a few years ago, 2013, which was actually called Baudrillard in Drag, and goes through those theories.
Yes, it was on Lady Gaga. We write on everything, ladies and gentlemen. We write on everything, and we do love Lady Gaga, can I say? But she was indeed working with that in terms of a tumbling femininity, tumbling feminism, and her politics. Can I say she must be horrified? Can I just say Lady Gaga's probably completely gaga about this. Let's talk about the staff leaving. I've never seen. I'm an old woman. I've never seen the number of staff leaving this administration, as I have seen, either leaving, walking out, walking away, Renee, or indeed being pushed. So what is this about? Noting Steve Bannon, as I said to you yesterday, for me, Steve Bannon was the brains trust of Trump. He was providing the ideas, the content, if you will. So now that the content man is gone, I think we've got a whole new stage 2 in the Trump presidency. But let's talk about the staff leaving. Yes,
I think it's interesting that there are still far-right advisors around in the White House. Stephen Miller, yes. Sebastian Gorka and others who've worked with Bannon right from the beginning. The interesting thing about Bannon, I think, is that he, with very little publicity actually, got on board as running the Trump campaign a year ago. Yeah. And within 7 months of being an advisor to the new Trump presidency has gone. But I think that idea I talked about before about longevity not actually meaning very much anymore. No. Actually, that's quite a long time given the sorts of debates that were going on, particularly conflicts between family and advisors within the White House, between generals and others in the White House. And I think you've got somebody like General Kelly, who was the National Security Advisor, Homeland Security Advisor, Chief. Once he came on board, you actually had supposedly Bannon's letter of resignation in the works. So I think that there is a militarisation actually in the White House. Trump really does almost fawn before the generals. He has a lot of ex-generals in his administration running things, and I think this is a very good example of it. So you've got a particular idea within that administration which is a fairly conventional militaristic outlook on the USA and the world, which somebody like Bannon, who was trying to get out of that, would have been horrified by. You get it over North Korea, for example, or, almost the conventional idea that you could have military conflict in North Korea, which didn't have very much effect.
That someone could win a nuclear war. I mean, we're back there.
We are. And there's a Cold War aspect to a lot of this, which I think you're going to see unfold. I think that will unfold at speed too. But that's a different shift in the whole US outlook in terms of foreign policy. There's lots of contradictions there going on in the White House.
And therefore I'm really interested, and I've got to really ponder this and do some work on it. If we're not dealing with the industrial-military complex or the military-industrial complex, we're actually dealing with the post-industrial military complex.
Yes, I think so.
And I think that's a radically different configuration.
I do.
Because in a post-work, post-manufacturing environment, the role of the military transforms.
Yes.
And if I can bring Althusser back rather than Foucault, then you're suddenly dealing with a repressive state apparatus that is much more in your face as part of daily culture and daily life, because the ISAs, the ideological state apparatuses, are simply no longer functional.
And that is a continuation, actually, of where the US, as the world's policeman, so-called, has been for decades, actually.
Yeah.
After the Cold War, that's what the US was. Once it was probed out of its isolationism in the late 1990s, the actual mode of operation is intervention, military intervention. You've still got that idea really all over the world today. That was something that Trump and Bannon and much of the far right was really committed to reversing. They haven't done that.
I mean, that's amazing. And you and I spent a lot of time, we've supervised a lot of PhD students probing the profound differences between neoliberalism and neoconservatism. And the radical differences. Lovely Min Young, hello to Min. Min did fantastic work on that particular paradigm and problem, and deep, heavy lifting work. And there is incredible heavy lifting to be done on this, that we are dealing with Trump with, I believe, the neoliberalism continues even after the global financial crisis, which showed that it was a failed paradigm. That's continued. But the neocon thing, through this military domination of the administration, is starting to create a bit of change.
It's starting to come back, yeah. which is what the far right were trying to stop.
That's right, because it really was, your right-wing culture in one nation. We're back to hyper-nationalism, protectionism.
Absolutely.
And the neocons require the exact opposite.
Yes, that's what Bannon and Breitbart stand for, if you read their website.
Yeah. So we've talked about the staff and I think radical changes we're going to see now that Bannon is gone. I think it will be radical. That's the big change for me. But the story is also about the Trump family, isn't it? With all these staff members who are not related leaving, the family has intensifified in their presence in the administration. What's that about?
Yes, I think we pointed this out in our original podcast, University of Trumpland, which was, as we said, just after the Trump presidency was announced, after the election. And you could see it, pretty quickly that there was a major family advisor thing around Trump, and it had obviously been there very much in the campaign itself. But someone like Jared Kushner, who has no qualifications for any of this, was elevated very quickly to a major advisor and clearly had conflicts with Bannon and co, but also conflicts with others within the White House. There was a real family versus division within the White House. There were lots of others, but that was a very important one, and it's clearly still very important. And these people aren't ideologues.
No.
And in a sense, Trump isn't either. He's a businessman trying to make money in the White House. And I think that is what the family is about. But they are more, conventional, almost Democrats. Actually, they're hardly Republicans. In the traditional sense, even though the Republicans own all of the houses at the moment, including the White House. But I think that there is just a conventional elevation of almost medieval family.
I'm glad you're saying that. That's what
it was always there in the businesses. That's how Trump was really schooled by his father. Yeah. If you go back in the history of the Trump family, and that's still very, very much there, and that's just a conventional kind of money-making, image-making thing. So there's that going on alongside all of these ideological battles.
Yeah, and I'm very interested, and we're doing a lot of work on popular culture in this period as well. So The Handmaid's Tale is obviously crucial, and I'm doing some work on that, because obviously that was a 1980s book that, of course, was Reagan's America, that magically and majestically and terrifyingly has come back with incredible resonance.
Yeah, and with a real basis. And I think that's also the thing about fears of World War III and so on. Yeah. I don't think that's been actually as true, people's fears of World War III. Even going back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, I don't think you've even had that really on the agenda. It really is on the agenda. People are serious about that now. And
it is Game of Thrones as well. We should really just put it is the families fighting against other families. It is Game of Thrones. So that's the oddity about the real and the representation, the simulacra, all getting all a bit blurred. Yeah. Because the Trump thing is starting to feel a lot like Game of Thrones. Yeah. So, how this is going to end, I'm really not sure. And it may involve dragons. We'll probably find out. Last question, Steve. And I've written a chapter in our book on the interregnum. I've gone pretty deeply into the interregnum, starting with the Gramscian rendering of the interregnum and going forward. Think about the interregnum, and it was also used, of course, in Isaac Asimov's wonderful trilogy, the Foundation trilogy. That was an interregnum period, a galactic interregnum. The interregnum is a really unstable time. I'm always interested in instability and liminality and everything sort of moving and a bit edgy and a bit agitated. But interregnums end, right?
Yes, they do.
Are we in an interregnum? Am I correctly configuring that? Now, your name is going to be on this book as well, so if I'm making a mistake, you need to tell me. But are we in an interregnum, and what could signal our pathway out of the interregnum?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're at the start of the interregnum. That's what I would say the Trump presidency, the Trump victory signifies. However long he lasts. You see Mike Pence as president within a year on some scenarios. But whatever happens with that, you've got, I think, somebody like Wolfgang Streeck, whose book's Buying Time and How Will Capitalism End?
Love that book.
both those books are recent books that I think people should read if they're interested in this stuff. He also has this idea that we're starting a battle which could last for years and decades. And he envisages this interregnum. You envisage this interregnum based on Gramsci's idea in many ways.
Yeah.
You've actually got, I think, a battle within the right.
There it is.
Within right discourse,
yeah.
New right and the old right. Yeah. And I think what's happening there is actually illustrated by Trump. He's got a foot in both camps, and he's starting to slide both feet away. Yeah. One of those is the basic neoliberalist, globalist idea.
Yeah.
And I think you still have a lot of politicians, global politicians, Malcolm Turnbull in Australia, for example, Angela Merkel in Germany, Trudeau in Canada, I would say Macron in France.
Agreed.
They are all globalist leaders.
So finance, capitalism, free trade, pretty groovy on keep the state out of people's personal lives.
I think they argue with each other about that, but yes. But I think that is one of those perspectives, and clearly Trump does have a foot in that. Yeah. But he's been, in a sense, famous, and people like Bannon have been famous, for starting, or I would say continuing, a populist neo-right movement, which is, as you said before, is economic nationalism on a scale that we haven't seen for a very long time. So this is important. It's an argument within the right, and that right is actually very strong. It has all sorts of far-right aspects. It has people like Le Pen, Marine Le Pen in France, who actually got a third of the vote.
People keep forgetting this.
She didn't win, but she got a third of the vote.
Yeah.
And there is a real surge of what our colleagues in the UK, Steve Hall, Simon Winlow and James Treadwell, called The Rise of the Right. Okay. Great book. Really need to read. People really need to read The Rise of the Right. But actually what's happening now is there is a split. So you've got the globalists and the neoliberals who are now moving to the centre very often. Turnbull is a great example in Australia, pinching Labour's clothes and putting on, actually legislating for social justice in some cases. Theresa May did that in the UK, but not enough to save her. Yeah. And I think they're conscious that the populists are on the rise. And one of the ways they attack the populists, the neo-right populists, is to move, in some senses socially, towards the centre. So you've got the neoliberals, the globalists, versus the protectionists. And I think Strink's theories are the best explanation of that. And I actually think that will be the interregnum, and it'll last for many, many years.
And also
uncertainty is the key.
Yeah, and it is uncertain. And if we just use those leaders, as we discussed, as examples of it. Yes. So, for example, with Turnbull, he's getting himself all knotted up and confused. And you just knew in Australia it was all going to get a bit messed up, that debate around sex and sexuality.
Absolutely.
Right? So something as no-brainer conservative as let gay people marry. I mean, we're not letting gay people, go and shove, shrubbery up several orifices. We're letting gay people marry, which is part of citizenship and democracy and rights. That's a conservative act.
It is.
Right?
I think
so. And so the idea that Turnbull's got himself all muddled up over something as straightforward and basic and conservative as that is a great example.
And that's a good example of the arguments within the right. So Turnbull, a former, free market liberal, libertarian, has actually got himself into such a state with a one seat majority, basically having to accept the conservatism of the former Prime Minister Tony Abbott and many people around him. So there's an argument there. That's not so much the populists, though. I think there are a lot of populists in Australia, but you've actually got an older argument in Australia between the free market liberals and the basic conservatives, almost Thatcher conservatives. But I do think on an international scale, the neoliberal globalists, and I think we have to really take this thing seriously, are on the wane.
They are.
And the neo-right populists, the rise of the right globally, is really on the rise. But the argument there is, I would emphasise in this interregnum, is between aspects of the right.
So therefore the final question, I didn't know I'd be going here, is what do people on the left or even on the progressive side of politics do if all the energy and fire in the interregnum is happening on the right? And I agree with you. My old argument used to be, Steve, that when the right splits, the left wins. Am I wrong?
I'd like to think that, but I think we've moved in a sense because in many ways what the left did was kind of hope that a kind of left liberalism would actually win out. I don't think that's the case. I think that's emasculated the left. And the interesting thing is that someone like Zizek has written a book called The Courage of Hopelessness recently, his most recent book.
Yeah.
Really, whatever you think of Zizek, I think that's an absolute must-read. And his argument is that we've gone so far down the tunnel, basically, the tunnel of hopelessness, and we needed to do that. We needed to get to almost to the bottom. That, you know, we are having to reconstruct arguments for the left on things like refugees, you know, migration, the economy, and so on. We've actually gone so far down this tunnel of hopelessness that we've almost really had to tell ourselves this is really, really bad, and that is the start of the fight back, of the courage of hopelessness.
And so, are you saying, therefore, that, say, Corbyn has that courage of hopelessness?
Oh, I think I think leaders like Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, the Syriza in Greece, without, you know, necessarily saying these people have got all the answers, I think there are movements and changes which are starting in this interregnum to come up with global ideas again.
Thank you, Steve. I really enjoyed that conversation, and as always, listeners, I hope you have as well. And contact Steve and I. You did in large numbers last time, so please feel free to have a chat. And if you think we've got something wrong, I'm sure we probably have. Please get in contact with us, and we're very happy to go again to keep thinking through these issues, because those of us that do believe in social change, social justice, and democracy, we need to keep talking through this, work out who we are, what we believe in, and what we are going to do, because these are theoretical times, but they're theoretical times with a purpose, with an agenda, and with momentum.